Hey folks, Dr. Mike Israetel here for Renaissance Periodization with my cool, so to speak, new beard that everyone, including my wife, hates. Maybe you'll hate it too. Folks, the good morning, not waking up and having a good time, but the good morning exercise to do what? Primarily to stimulate hypertrophy in your hamstrings, but also a little bit in your glutes, a little bit in the adductors, sartorius, and all those other muscles that tend to extend the hip, and really good actually for the spinal erectors and some of the other muscles in the back. So primary target is the hamstrings, so we'll focus on making sure we do the exercise well. Let's get into the common mistakes and how to fix them. First two mistakes, they're sort of a combo mistake and they're super common, done very much often together, is bending the knees improperly. So if you go back, by the way, to our stiff-legged deadlift video, tons of these are almost the identical recommendations because it's a very similar lift. But you might remember from that video, there are two mistakes to make at the knees. One is to completely lock your knees out, which does a good job of pre-stretching the hamstrings and then trying to bend over. You can do that, but it tends to put a lot of stress and strain on the knees. It can hurt them a little bit. It's probably not a huge risk for injury, but you can't actually produce a ton of force with your hamstrings like that. So you end up sacrificing the ability to put tension through the muscle to really pre-stretch it, probably a bit too much. So what you want to do instead is keep your knees just a little bit out of the locked position, relatively straight, but notice they're not locked, they're right here. As you move your hips back, you keep your knees in the exact same spot, and that pre-stretches and puts tons of tension on the hamstrings, but still lets them produce a lot of force as opposed to if they were locked backwards. The huge temptation if you're not locking your knees is to go the other way. As you go down deeper, it becomes apparent to your body that you can actually move more weight and hurt your hamstrings less, or rather feel the stretch less, if you bend your knees on the way down. So it's super tempting, even if you manage to have pretty good technique, to let your knees start bending. What that does is takes tension off of the hamstrings, and now it's sort of like a partial deadlift exercise with the bar on your back, really sort of pointless. So what we want to do, make sure our knees are good by keeping them just out of the locked position, and then let the hips do the rest of the bending. We bend at the hips and nowhere else. Next mistake is letting the pelvis posteriorly tilt, thus rounding the lower back. One bad thing. The second bad thing is you actually take tension away from the hams. So check this out. The whole purpose of this movement is to load the hamstrings. The hamstrings cross the knee joint and the hip joint. So what you want to do is keep your legs straight, not locked, but straight at the knees, and you want to pre-stretch the hamstrings by anteriorly tilting your pelvis, basically pushing your butt back, right? A lot of bad stuff about anterior pelvic tilt, mostly made up by people who don't know what they're talking about. Some of it's valid in extreme circumstances, but in the good morning, you want to anteriorly tilt your pelvis because that pre-stretches the hamstrings, and now when you bend, it's a hamstring dominant movement. If you allow, as you bend, for your pelvis to posteriorly tilt, you end up rounding over. Even if your lower back doesn't round, but just your pelvis comes down, what ends up happening is that the hamstrings are no longer having a ton of tension throughput through them, and they're not the prime mover, and thus they're not the target. Now it's something that maybe the glutes are more involved in, and yes, you can lift more weight, but you'll notice, and this is how to tell if you're doing it, if you're properly anterior tilting your pelvis, what's gonna happen is you're gonna feel a ton of tension, painful tension, through the hamstrings, the back of your leg, as you get deeper and deeper. As soon as the pelvis starts to get into posterior tilt, you're not going to be able to feel that tension anymore. So the good thing is you have a cheat sheet inside your own body, how your hamstrings feel, to know if you're doing this right. So the big emphasis here is as soon as you're locking back, keep that pelvis tilted. That doesn't mean you have to round or arch your back. Your spine can be neutral, it can be arched, whatever way feels more comfortable for you. That pelvis has to be anteriorly tilted. So as you go down and down and down, you want tension on your hamstrings. The next pair of mistakes is about range of motion. Two ways to screw this up. One is an insufficient range of motion, and this is when folks do everything right, and then they get to where they don't really feel their hamstrings stretch and painfully a lot yet, and they'll just kind of come up, right? And they'll go down and come up. And externally it looks like they're doing a good job, but they're so much more flexible. they could have a lot more stretch under tension for their hamstrings if they went lower. How do you know you're not going deep enough? When you don't have a perceptively painful, not crazy pain, but some painful stretch in your hamstring, that's when you know you're going deep enough. If you're not going deep enough, you can probably tell if it doesn't feel that bad on your hamstrings. Going deeper means you get to use less weight, but do a good job hypertrophying the muscle more. It's kind of a win-win. If you cut your depth a lot and you do these bullshit halfway good mornings, you're really not doing a good job of stimulating your hamstrings, and it's a ton of load to bear on the spine, causes more fatigue. On the other hand, if you want extra credit for depth, here's the deal. You can only go as deep as your lower back won't round into, so neutral or arched, and your knees still locked and your pelvis anteriorly tilted. At some point, given a certain load, flexibility, and experience, you'll only be able to hit a certain depth. Going lower requires you to sacrifice in one of those three areas. One, your upper back has start to round, not the purpose of the movement. You can lose a lot of tension that way in force production. Two is your pelvis starts to tilt posteriorly, again, taking tension off the hands. And three, you can start to bend your knees, wholly pointless. So there is such a thing as too much range of motion. You want enough range of motion to where you really feel it in your hams with good technique, but only so much that you don't have to compromise by rounding over. The right range of motion, painful tension, is a really, really good way to go. The next mistake is not having a standardized range of motion. If each good morning is a little bit different depth, not a terrible thing, but the problem is it's difficult to assign a stimulus. If you want to do a little bit more this time than last time, you actually don't know how much total work was done, force times distance. So you might, by cutting your reps a little bit this time, but using more weight, end up doing less work this time, not have as overloading of a session as you could have. Secondarily, how are you supposed to track your performance over time if you're cutting your depth to different types? Even if you're trying your best, sometimes it's really hard to make sure you're getting the same depth every time. However, this is a solved problem, which is why for this part of the video, I'm in the rack. Set up your rack height, and it's gonna take some time to figure out which one is best at the very point in your range of motion where, with your working weight, because sometimes less weight on the bar doesn't put you into that extreme of a flexible position. So you'll have to experiment with this, but at some point you'll find a bar height, which we have right there, which for me is the right height to get me into that exact perfect range of motion that gives me a ton of tension and stretch on my hamstrings while the rest of my body doesn't have to get out of position. So now, instead of doing this, which is the mistake, okay, this is a good rep, and then this one I get deeper, and that kind of felt like shit, so I do this. How many reps is that? Who knows? Now we have the supports, I can make sure to lock into my technique, and every time gently touch and come up, and every time gently touch and come up. And now I know exactly how many reps I did because they were all the same. And here's a really cool part. I can focus more on feeling my hamstrings and making sure all of the rest of my body is in position, and the bars will let me know when I've gotten low enough. Because a lot of times there's a lot of shit to think about. You think, okay, I gotta keep my pelvis tilted and I gotta keep my chest up and all this other, my knees, what about my knees? And then you're like, wait a minute, am I deep enough yet? My hamstrings kind of hurt, but do they hurt enough? Once you have a standardized range of motion, all you have to do is think about your technique, feeling the tension on your hams, and you know exactly when to come up, when you feel a gentle touch, and that's it. A huge part of the reason we do good mornings is to focus on the eccentric phase. Because the eccentric phase, the controlled descent, lengthening the muscle while it's being tensed, is hugely hypertrophic. You can make this easier on yourself by dive bombing into the good morning, and then all of a sudden you don't have a ton of tension during the eccentric phase, right? So instead of doing this, where you slowly ease in with your working weight and come up, you're now doing this, whoop, and then you go, ah, and then whoop, you drop in and boom. Two problems with that. One, dropping into your hamstrings like that with a lot of weight absolutely increases your injury risk. It doesn't make it super high, but definitely high enough for you to not want to do it. Part two, we're here to get the hypertrophy from the eccentric phase, even though it sucks. My personal recommendation to you, just accept that good mornings suck and fucking do them to get bigger hamstrings. Don't try to rush them. You're thinking, oh man, this blows. If I went faster, it would be less time under pain. But you came here for the pain. Take your time. You don't have to do a 5-second eccentric and wait for forever, but control on the eccentric, gentle touch, and then coming up is way better than boom, and then trying to come up as fast as you can. Next mistake is rebending the knees on the way up. So a lot of folks have no problem getting into good position, keeping their knees back on the way down, but then they want some extra help standing up. What sometimes they'll do is they'll rebend their knees, they'll essentially bend them a little bit here and almost squat the weight up. Good news is you can do more reps that way. Bad news is the reps don't count for shit because you're missing out on the concentric work of the hamstrings. You got the eccentric, hey, you're halfway there. But now it's time to use your hamstrings with the knees in the same position to come up with the weight. If you rebend, you use less hamstrings, cool, you did a rep, but who cares because the target muscle wasn't the one most activated. The next mistake isn't so much a mistake, but it's a really cool tip to make sure your technique actually hits the hams the most. A lot of folks, the good morning is seen as a bending over, and that's not technically wrong, but it's helpful to think about it another way. So some people, they'll get everything locked in and they'll start to bend forward. And like to the external eye, it might look pretty good. The problem is I'm on my toes here, I'm not producing a ton of force, and because I'm bent forward, the pelvis usually starts to tilt and I don't feel my hamstrings as much as I could. It's much better to focus on this movement as keeping the chest up while pushing the hips back. So you essentially want to touch something really far behind you with your butt. Take that for what it is, but when you're pushing back, it ends up being as long as you keep your knees back and your chest up, the movement auto-corrects and it's an absolutely baller feeling on your hamstrings versus if I think about it as going forward, I might look decent enough, but I don't produce as much force, my hamstrings aren't as involved, no bueno. Next mistake is overvaluing hand position and head position. We're gonna do a 2-for-1 again. Here's the deal, folks. Why the hell am I holding the bar like this? And is this really a standard bar? Am I really 6'9"? No. The reason I'm holding the bar like this is because I am pretty inflexible because my arms are so goddamn big nowadays. Haha, a little Rich Piana there for you. I actually can't grab the bar normally and have it sit comfortably on my neck, okay? So what is so wrong with me putting my hands here? Well, nothing if the bar is stable and I'm able to execute the reps no problem with the bar being stable on my back. Whichever grip you use that is comfortable for your elbows, your wrists, your shoulders, and your neck is totally fine. As long as it's a high bar position right underneath your neck, your traps are scooted back, any grip you want to use is fine, and I can only demo this one because I guess I finally got jacked enough to essentially be immobile, all right? Second point, what about the head? A lot of folks will say head position, you gotta look down because something extensor activation, or you gotta look up, something extensor activation. Believe it or not, people use both of those to justify supposedly good technique. Here's what you do with your head. Whatever the hell you like, as long as it helps you maintain really good technique, nice tight back, butt back, knees straight, and a ton of force. If you're strongest here and you're looking down and everything is good about your movement, that's awesome, do that. If, like me, you're strongest somewhere in the intermediate, that's totally fine too, so you can look sort of a little bit down and forward. Some folks, many folks, like to look up with their good mornings, especially as the weight gets heavier, because that's a cue for them not to round their back. Whatever you like works. Here's the thing. None of this will get you hurt because there's no force transduction through your cervical spine. If you think that you're gonna get hurt looking up, don't ever go to New York City and look up at skyscrapers because there's the same amount of force through your neck there. You could just get hurt looking up. Next problem we could run into is not feeling the tension through the hams like we want. Here's the deal. There are no golden rules here except for the basics of making sure your knees are nice and straight, your hips are bending, and your back is at least neutral. Everything else is really down to what you feel the most. So some folks will take a close stance and it'll work super, super well for them. They'll actually feel their hams. Some people with a close stance can't get the flexibility here and they don't really feel much of anything. Some people are better with a medium stance. Some folks with a wide stance. Sumo good mornings are absolutely a thing. To you, they might feel crappy. That might mean to somebody else they feel good, so feel free to experiment. Hand positions, foot positions, also how far you turn your feet out. You can point your feet straight, you can point them out a little bit, and if you're doing sumo, you can point them out a lot. Whatever lets you feel the hams actually working, producing lots of force, and what's comfortable for your knees, hips, and so on and so forth. Also depth. Some folks will get to a certain depth and feel a great combination of tension and stretch. That means they have a painful stretch and they're using lots of weight. That's where they prefer. They could use less weight and go even deeper, but then The pain is still there, but the tension and the load is so light that they might not get as good of an effect. They might not see as much soreness, might not get as good of a pump. Here's the deal. Use the basic techniques to funnel your technique into something that's very good. Within that, the foot and hand positions and everything is an experiment for you to try to see what feels best for you. The last mistake here is going too heavy or too light on good mornings. What's too heavy on the good mornings? Generally, they're very good to do in the 5 to 10 rep range. However, with stiff-legged deadlifts, going as low as 5 reps on the first set seems to be okay, and people seem to be able to conserve their technique. With good mornings, for some reason, I've personally found with a lot of folks I've worked with that anything less than about 8 reps per set, on a first set especially, tends to be so heavy that it becomes difficult to focus on the technique, and you end up just rounding your back just a little, nothing unsafe, your knees bend a little more than you want, and it becomes an exercise with which to lift lots of weight, as opposed to one in which you can really expose your hamstrings to tension. So what I would recommend is sets of at least 8 reps. What about much higher than that? Well, anything above 15 reps really just turns into endurance work for your erector muscles, which is cool, but not the reason we do this exercise. 45-degree back raises, flexion rows, those are better for that muscle, right? So anything north of 15 reps is probably not great. Ideally, and hilariously for bodybuilding purposes, the 8 to 12 range is super, super well suited for good mornings. Folks, thank you so much for tuning in. Good luck practicing your good mornings. Remember, the weight on the bar is not nearly as important as getting really, really good technique. Set yourself up on the bars to make sure you're getting the same depth every time. Really focus on keeping your chest up, on keeping your knees nice and just tiny little bit of bend, the same bend every time. Anteriorly tilt that pelvis, do your best possible job. You know you're doing a job well when you get nasty delayed onset soreness in your hamstrings. Good luck, do your best. We'll see you next time for the next technique video, and if you have any questions or suggestions for other videos to shoot and other techniques to try, shoot it in the comments. See you guys later. So the next tip is to make sure that our hips are in line with our